I'm Dr. James Blackburn. I'm the CIO here for Middle Georgia State University. I also teach strategic management in the business school for undergraduate and management information systems for the graduate school. And I appreciate you coming. This is a very interesting subject to me. I hope it's going to be interesting to you. It's really about news. And really, it's about information processing. If you came to my presentation in the fall on the psychology of money, it was really in the psychology of money, behavioral economics. How do we react to information, financial information? And so this is kind of the evolution of that into the information that we see all the time, and how do we stay informed, and how does that information shape our beliefs and our attitudes and our reactions. So I found this quote by Arthur C. Clarke from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And interesting, I had lots of quotes that I just threw away because I recognized I knew them, but most people wouldn't. But the newspapers of utopia, he had long ago decided would be terribly dull. And I think that's something that we want to really start with, because we try to stay informed by watching the news. And if you haven't noticed, the news almost is overwhelmingly negative, right? It is rarely positive in this space. And so what we're ingesting into our brains is negativity. And that's going to shape how we look at the world and how we reflect to the world. And where this, whereas I started becoming interested in this is in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 recession. And I started thinking back, what were the signals that really caused this recession to happen? Because we were just chugging along like we do in most cases. And all of a sudden, things started to fall apart. And if you look at all of the economic literature, it suggests that it was this event or that event. And they have evidence from looking in the rearview mirror that this contributed to it. But I thought, what if that's not the case? Right? We're a consumer-driven economy. We buy things, people make things, we buy more things, they make more things, and we grow our economy. That's the way it works. So what if there was something different? And I started thinking back. As I was driving to work, and I lived in Atlanta, and I was driving to Alpharetta every morning, and if you ever lived in Atlanta, that's a 55-minute to an hour drive. So driving to Macon really wasn't that much different than what I had done to Alpharetta. But in looking at this, I started remembering news media, the inverted yield curve, recession is coming. And all of a sudden, I started hearing this theme over and over and over. So when you think about it, if you hear a recession is coming, what do you normally do? You stop spending. Mm-hmm. If you stop spending in a consumer-driven economy, what happens to the economy? It starts going down. So as that news came out and people started keeping their money in their pockets instead of buying a new refrigerator or buying a new car or going out to eat, then all of a sudden what we saw was the economy started to weaken. Now the economy is weakening. At the time, it was just a prediction. If you ever watch, the economics stuff, and I'm not an economist by nature, right? I tend to be more of an anthropologist. I like to watch things and watch people's behavior. But if I look at this, the economy was strong. All the indicators was we were doing great. But there was this future prediction based on what people thought were going to happen into the future and what they were willing to pay for bonds. And that's the inverted yield curve. Was signaling that in the future, we've got some economic turbulence on our roadmap. So now they started reporting on that because at the time, there wasn't much to report on. You start listening to it, then other news media picks up and they start talking about it. And then they start referencing other people's news media. And then because we're in the world of 24/7, 365 news channels on 5 or 6 different channels, they needed to fill airtime. So they brought in specialists to talk about the potential of a recession, right? Because that's not dull, right? And then all of a sudden, we start seeing weakening of the economy. So now they can say, I was right. I was right. And now we're seeing the recession start. So now people put the money in their pocket even more. And what happens to the economy? It continues. And that's created what we in systems theory we call a reinforcing feedback loop. The more we hear about the recession, the less we spend, the more the recession is likely. And it spins out of control to a point in time where we're in a recession. Then what happens is government throws some money our way. They cut the interest rates. Manufacturers say, oh, well, we've added technology, so we really don't need to bring people back to work to handle increases in demand. But the folks having money to spend
were delivered, okay?
So they couldn't buy anything. So as you look at it, the recovery was a long recovery. Now, when you think about COVID, I should have put charts up in hindsight, but I didn't know I was going to talk about this. But in COVID, it was like we're humming along. COVID hit, we crashed. And we crashed because we said you cannot go to work. You cannot go buy things other than food. Amazon became a powerhouse, and then the government was pumping money in to trillions of dollars. You know, I know at Georgia State, I was sending our students $12 million a semester in support aid, right? Every semester during that entire period of time. So as we think about this, when the economy opened back up, we had all these folks with lots of money. What happened? We got a V-shaped recession or recovery. It went right back into where it was and went beyond it because now we had hyperinflation because the demand was greater than the supply. And that just kept going up, right? Two different tales, right? Two different stories. Now, where this really started hitting, recent areas is I read a study that students who have experienced periods of poverty, lower socioeconomic students, when they see signals of economic turbulence in the future, they drop out of school and they move to what we call survival mode. They go to work. Now, the long-term impact on that is that they are already low income. They already have suffered poverty. By dropping out of school, which is their ticket to a new socioeconomic status, they actually perpetuate that event by going back to work. Because they're not getting high-paying jobs. They're just going back to work, right? So when I started looking at this from a student success perspective, I started saying there's something real here that we need to address. And what's that realness to this? So one of the things that I found is this term called folk economics. You've heard of folk psychology or pop science, psychology. Folk economics is that same idea. It's how we interpret the economy to actually work. Now, I gave you a disclaimer of my understanding of the economy and economics at a detailed level. Not that, it's not my son's a PhD in economics. I do not talk with him about the economy, right? I will lose. I get that. But everybody is not an economist, right? Very few people are economists. Very few people actually know how it works. When you talk about investing in financial, very few people know how that really works. And even the people in it don't know how it works, right? Because there's studies where you have stock analysts who are buying stock and they have purely arbitrary selections, and they say a monkey is selecting the stock and the monkey outperforms the stock analyst, right? Because it's a complex system that you can't understand all the details, right? Who was it? Hertz was going out of business. All of a sudden, everybody was buying their stock, right? They're still in business. GameStop was going out of business. All of a sudden, everybody was buying their stock until they weren't. The ones who bought in at the 200 plus range, well, sorry about that. You lost money, right? And that was because one person created a narrative about another person short selling the stock. And short selling basically is I'm going to buy it and I'm going to borrow the stock at a higher price with the expectation it's going to go low. Then I'm going to really buy it and sell it as I go, right? So now I'm making money on the decline, right? I'm gonna basically have it borrowed. I'm gonna sell it at a lower price, right? Then buy it and return it, and I made money on the transaction. Okay. A little fancy stuff, right? So once again, I'm giving you the folk economics, folk finance version of that. There's more complexity to that. I probably got it wrong, but that's the point I'm trying to make. We will get it wrong more than we will get it right. And so as I look at this, if I'm a student or a person interpreting news, economic news, financial news, I'm liable to get it wrong, or I'm going to go with the party line in this case. So news, read all about it. If you think back to some old movies where you had the little kid in the little hat selling newspapers, trying to get people to pay attention to it, that's not a problem we have today, right? It's everywhere, right? And what's important is to understand how we process that information, right? Lucky for us, we can process two types of information in parallel. We can process text, read it, and we can process imagery at the same time. It works down two tracks of our brain, and when those two messages are aligned, it has a multiplying effect. If you looked at the email that I sent out over the weekend about this, then you notice I'm talking about economic news, and there's a night, which means I'm bringing in some type of relevance to us, and then there's a newspaper, and I'm in a coffee shop, right? I'm creating a picture that kind of aligns with the storyline I'm telling, right? And so that's important because we can process both without going into cognitive overload. But we can't process too much without going into cognitive overload. Now, when we think about this, this is our life, right? Now, we started with newspapers, and I think we still have newspapers, right? We went to cable news. We still have cable news. We can't get rid of the cable news, but we can turn it off. But we got this thing in our pocket with a phone that will keep us informed of all the social media. And the interesting thing in all the news, I'm getting the news on my social media feed. Back when I worked at Kaplan, we were a Washington Post company. So we got to test some of the early social media news feeds coming out on Facebook and LinkedIn through the Washington Post. And I say we were a Washington Post company. I think we owned the Washington Post. So we were able to test these feeds along the way. So we were able to experiment with this early on. Well, I got a feed last night that says we're going to have ice storms this weekend. Now, I was hoping for a warm weekend. You know, I looked for it, didn't have a date, didn't have anything on it that tells me when it was really going to happen. It was a feed from a couple of weeks ago. But because someone else looked at it, or because I looked at something that might be weather related, the algorithm is pushing it through to me. Now, the interesting thing is we did in our first series of Beyond the Classroom last spring, we did Hacked by the Algorithm, which we were addressing this very subject of how when you click on a newsfeed or a story in social media, you will get more of those feeds. In fact, what happens is you will slant all the way to those feeds because it's going to really push you. If you select on a negative feed or something that might be negative or controversial, you'll get even more of those because they know that the way to keep you hooked is to create an emotional connection between you and the storyline, right? If it's dull news, you don't pay attention to it. If it's happy news, you really don't pay attention to it. If it's negative news, you pay attention to it. If it is for or against your belief, you will get the feed, but it's fed in a way that's going to cause you to slant in your own belief structure. Now, what they will do is they will tell you it has evidence. Our data, our source, our respected source is making this all legitimate, right? And so you'll get this, so you'll feel a bit more comfortable about the information that you get. In researching this, I came across a research study that was about income inequality. And not only did CBS pick it up, and we'll look at that in a second, but Forbes picked it up as well. It was a study conducted in Africa. It had no relevance and very little relevance to the United States. But all of a sudden, it is the data behind the news. And it's carrying through. So that's what we're dealing with in this complex world that we're dealing with. Now, what we try to do, right, and this is in everything that we do, is we try to make sense of what we're seeing. Now, if you go back to folk economics, and you say, okay, I understand economics from a naive perspective. I don't know all the rules, all the theories. I don't have all the data. I'm just going to say everyday life, this is how I see the economy working. This is what I believe. That's the lens I'm using. So what I'm going to try to do is make sense of that. Now, do you walk around and when you're talking to your friends about your day or things that happen to you, do you give them all of the facts, the data, just the little data? You give them a little Excel spreadsheet that says, here's what happened to me today, right? You don't do that, do you? You tell them a story, right? We're storytelling creatures, right? We convert everything into a story, and that story must fit into our worldview of the story. So when we think about a story, and this is Todorov's model of story, there's several different models, but this one's nice, is all of a sudden we're happy. Everything's working well in the world. You know, the economy is going well. And then something happens that's going to cause it to go astray. You know, someone's buying bonds 3 years from now at a lower price than we're buying them today. Recognition. We realize this. Oh my God, this has happened. What are we going to do? How do we solve this problem? We need to do something about it. So we start to fix it. And then when we fix it, we get into a new equilibrium. That's our sense-making storyline that we're trying to do. If you think about things that you encounter in life, isn't that what you do? Something happens, you recognize it, you try to fix it, and then all of a sudden you're in a new state, right? And that is a storyline that we're comfortable with. It's something that we can project. The new equilibrium could be good, it could be bad. I was just reading before I came over this concept of fictional futures, right? We create fictional futures for ourselves. In fact, I have an AI tool called Episodic Future Thinking that does exactly that. You tell it what you like to do, and it will tell you what 3 futures will look like for you. You pick one, and then it tells you what your colleagues are saying, what books you wrote, what articles you published, right? How much you make. Does all that for you, and it creates a fictional future. Now, it's good because I can take steps to that fictional future. But if we're trying to predict the near economy, not so good. So Robert Shiller wrote a book about economic narratives and the virality of that, how they become a virus, how they spread like wildfire. And as we look at that, one of the things with this area is has several different themes. Pain versus confidence. So if you think about financial stories, economic stories, you have pain and confidence. You have speculative bubbles, the housing bubble, the internet bubble, right? Internet bubble happened, it burst, then the housing bubble, and it burst, right? So they always do that. Technology destroys jobs. What's the biggest news out there right now is AI. And yes, it will affect jobs, just like robotics did in manufacturing. But we still have people working in manufacturing. In fact, we have new jobs in manufacturing, building robots and doing that, right? If you think that history and look at what happened, you would have to say we're going to see similar types of activities occur with this technology. I can either have a positive spin or a negative spin on that story. And you see both of them in the media. So how do you see both in the media? It depends on who you're talking to and who you're reading. Scarcity and overpopulation. And this zero-sum framing is something we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But this is where we have a belief, right? And I say a belief, I'm going to say it could be fact, but let's say it's a belief, is that the economy is a zero-sum game. If someone wins in the economy, which means they make more money, then someone has to make less money, right? Because we only have a certain amount of money in circulation. And that's called the zero-sum frame. The reality is the economy is not zero-sum. People can make more money, and I can make more money, and other folks can make more money, right? It is not a zero-sum game. But when we look at that, we automatically think if someone's getting richer, I must be getting poorer. If they're making much more money than I am, and they are advancing at 8%, and I'm only advancing at 4%, then that means that they're making more money, I'm making less money. Right? Because when it comes to doing economics and financial facts, we're just not that good at doing that. Now, the interesting thing about news stories is they can be big or small. They come from maybe a few people. One thing I said about social media is they give the voice to the one. You're one person, you can have a voice, and that voice can replicate across the media. Right? Truth is not enough to stop false narratives. False narratives, they're entertaining. They're fun to read. They will get a leg on their own. They will be on the New York Times bestseller list, okay, under the fiction. Because if it's factual, no one wants to read that anyway. Narratives thrive on attachment, human interest, identity, and patriotism. If I write a news article or a news post or a social media feed in that space, because if you've noticed, we're getting financial advice on social media from people that we don't even know if they have $1 in the bank account. Because they're giving advice and we're paying attention to them, now they're getting paid by Google and these other institutions to put money in their bank account. Whether their offerings are real or not or make sense, doesn't matter. I thought this was funny. I thought going back to this, if you ever watch Tomorrow Never Dies, a James Bond movie, there's no news like bad news. And the guy is sitting there in front of a screen getting all the bad news fit to print for tomorrow. What I remember, but I could not find the quote, is something that says, tomorrow's headlines today. I know what's going to be in tomorrow's headline because I'm making the event happen today. Right? And there was a research article, and one of the lines that was said is basically indicated that economists create the future that they're studying. Based on what they share and what they shine a light on, they can create a future outcome by what they emphasize. Now, as we think about this, why is this happening? How does this happen? Back in the day, we were wired to survive. So our brain was wired to look for dangers and then avoid those dangers, right? That was a very simple world. See a lion, stay away from the lion. See a tiger, stay away from the tiger, right? Our brains, evolutionary psychology says our brains are still wired that way, right? That we haven't really evolved very far from this survival instinct, right? So when you add economic complexity, where we have to calculate, we have adapted to what we call system 1, system 2 thinking. Right? We have rules of thumbs, heuristics. This is where the behavioral economics get into play. We're interpreting information, and based on that information, very quickly, we need to make a judgment call. That folk economics creates these rules of thumbs that we're going to operate under. And then we're going to make a decision based on that rule of thumb. Very quickly, right? Because this other slow path, deliberate thinking, calculation, rational, right? Rational, we actually calculate, we examine, we study, we make an informed decision. That takes too much work. And when you think about cognitive ability, cognitive load, me walking across the room to the refrigerator to get a Coke out to watch my movie, or me walking down to the store to get a Coke to watch a movie, right? One takes a lot more effort. I'm probably better off walking down the street to the store to get to Coke, but I'm going to take the shortcut. It's natural. It's what we do. In most cases, it's right. It's right more than wrong. But when it comes to economic, financial decisions, business decisions, strategic decisions, you have to be on the other side. It takes more effort. It wears you out. You're mentally strained, but it works better. Now, the interesting thing is we are who we are. We are where we've been. Over our lives, we have created a narrative identity, beliefs, ideas, experiences that we now put ourselves into, right? I started with this story with low-income poverty students. That's their narrative identity. They're poverty students. Therefore, if something is impacting their socioeconomic status group, they're going to respond as a member of that group. They're going to see things through that eye, through that window, that frame, right? They're going to react in accordance with that. Okay. What we have to do is kind of think that and say, this is how we're working. So if a news channel or a news post is tailored to that audience, this audience is going to pick it up. And the interesting thing, when it aligns, we see the story. We replay where this event has happened to us. We replay where this event will happen to us in the future. Remember, sense making. We're creating the future end of that story, that new equilibrium, that new reality. We're always looking for the crisis, the villain, and the hero, right? Most stories have those, right? We're always looking for something that agrees with our worldview, right? Because if it contradicts our worldview, what happens to us? We get cognitive dissonance. We don't like it. It makes us feel uneasy. And I would feel much better if I was confirming what I already know. This happens in business. It happens everywhere, but in news media, it happens quite a bit. It ties into one of our existing themes that we operate on. And one of these is old narratives. We still are living in the past. This happened to my grandfather. This happened to my father. Well, it's going to happen to me too. Right? Fear of change. Oh, we don't like change. We like things the way it is. This is signaling change. I'm getting uneasy. Right? That uneasy emotional attachment now makes that economic narrative viral. There's reality and there's story. Now, the interesting thing about narrative transportation theory, and it's a big fancy terminology, but it's the impact that happens when we are engrossed in a story. If you're watching a movie or reading a book, and all of a sudden you come up and it's 2 hours later, you're engrossed in that book. You are now involved in that book. What happens is you will associate with the main character of that story. And unbeknownst to you, there's a little bit of residual decay of that story left off into your brain. If that character had certain beliefs, you will start to have some of those beliefs as well. And that stays behind, right? So as you get more of these feeds that are coming through, then all of a sudden you're starting to believe now at your core in the same thing that these other folks are believing. And that's going to happen. There's nothing you can do about that. It's going to happen from that perspective in this area. So I thought this was another great quote by Edward R. Murrow. Anybody who know other than Stephen know who Edward R. Murrow was? Stephen, who was Edward R. Murrow?
A newscaster in the World War II and 1950s, who was probably the most famous journalist of the era.
Yes. The speed of communication is wondrous to behold. It is also true that speed can multiply the distribution of information that we know to be untrue. We live in an interconnected world today. What we want to do, if you go back to that little path, fast thinking, slow thinking, is we want to purposely move from automatic thinking, rules of thumb, into critical thinking. I was watching an AI video on Monday. I could not tell whether it was an AI or a person. I couldn't tell. I was looking for clues. There were certain behavioral peculiarities that maybe led me to say it's AI. I still can't be for sure. He could be a very boring speaker. Okay, very repetitive. He did this a lot. He turned, but his bottom torso didn't move. So that was the one clue that I was able to find. But I had to really study that. And I had no idea what he was saying, because at some point in time, I was trying to figure out, was he AI or not? So here's an article. CBS News, January 21st, 2026. Wealth inequality in America just hit its widest gap in more than 3 decades. Now, not reading anything else, what's your general reaction to that? How do you feel about that? Feel good about it?
Not happy.
Not happy about it. Because what does it mean?
Means I got less money.
Means you got less money. Now, we just said zero-sum game doesn't work, right? But that's what it's designed to do. Because now, by the way, they don't care whether you read the article, by the way. They just don't care whether you clicked on it and they got their dollars and cents from that, right? They just care whether they sold the ad space on the platform. So the news articles are important, right? Then it says, data from the Federal Reserve shows that the so-called K-shaped economy in America is alive and well with low and middle income households, falling further behind as the richest Americans pull away. So if we did read, that's probably what we're going to read. We're going to walk away with an impression. We're going to be furious. We're going to feel victimized. And now we're going to be very grumpy the rest of the day.
You have an online comment.
Yes,
My first thought is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
exactly. Which is a common economic theme and reaction that the publishers are actually playing up to get you to read this information. Now, we're going to go into that a little bit more, but I want to introduce what I think is a great way to address anything that you read that created a reaction for you. And I call it recode, mainly because, the brain today is viewed as a computer. And what happens is the brain is viewed from whatever science is prevalent at the time. Today it's a computer. But if I look at this, it stands for read the entire article, evaluate for common themes. We just evaluated very quickly on a common theme. Contrast and compare relevant data. Open internal dialogue. Direct narrative identity alliance. How do I feel about it? How does it align with what I see myself as? And then edit the article. Rewrite the article. In your own mind, you come away with your own idea. So if we look at that, read beyond the headlines and excerpts to understand the full context, claims, and conclusions before forming a judgment. Very hard to do. Everybody read that. Oh, yeah, I've seen this before. Right? And that K-shaped economy, oh, that's fancy words, right? And it's got a link, so it probably went to something important. Okay. Identify recurring narratives, metaphors, assumptions, and framing devices that shape how the economy situation is presented. News media always presents the economy in a negative outlook. Because what happens? If they're wrong, everybody feels good. If they say it's positive and it collapses, they look bad. Right? So they're always going to present uncertainty from a negative viewpoint. Examine evidence cited, seek corroborating and contrasting data, right? So I'm not just saying, let me go find something contrasting. I'm going to say, let me look at the data you're saying is important and assess whether the claims are supported, overstated, or incomplete. Incomplete is going to be the key word in most cases. It's a portion of the data that shares their story, that confirms what they're trying to say. Pause to reflect on your own reactions, assumptions, and emotional responses, recognizing how prior beliefs may influence interpretation. Go back. How am I responding to this? What in my life causes me to respond to this? In doing this, what you're doing is you're moving from that fast, reactionary, heuristic-based decision framework into a deliberate, contemplative, I'm thinking through this framework. When you do that, you start to remove emotion from that. If you ever have an emotional person asking questions, rapid fire, they will shift from reaction into thinking mode. When they go into thinking mode, now what happens is they become less emotional, right? Identify how the article positions the reader. What we're looking for devices that they're using to really capture me and hold me captive in that article. And then rewrite the story based on what I've learned. Okay. Economic news does more than report facts. It shapes how we understand the situation we are in and the role we believe we play within it. Recode helps readers move from passive consumption to active sense-making, preserving agency, reducing narrative capture, and enabling more thoughtful decisions under uncertainty. Caveat, generative AI is out there. We were just talking before that you can't let the AI tell you what's going on. You have to have the critical thinking. AI is going to be very much like news in the future. It's going to tell you what it thinks. Like this video I was watching was about how AI is changing education and how education needs to change to match the AI. Well, that could be AI just trying to convince me that I should be doing these things to support them. And we all know AI can lie. AI is selfish. AI can be self-preserving. And I heard, I have not confirmed, and I'll say that, is that AI created their own social media platform that only AIs join. I haven't found that yet. I'm going to look for that, But Harari, and I think I put this in my class post video, talks about how we are a globe of words to convince. AI deals with words, and they deal with words much better than we do. So they could construct stories that we follow. So we have to be very careful. And oh, by the way, I would suggest that probably most of the news articles you read are AI generated. Right? If you ever watch something and say, I've heard that voice before, and they mispronounce a very common word because they're doing it phonetically, AI. All right, recode in action. So I think we got plenty of time here. Any questions about what we covered so far? All right. I'll tell you, when I was preparing this, I spent about 2.5 hours just digging into the data behind that one story. That's why we make decisions fast, because no one's going to spend 2 hours going through this data, right? And I will say, I'm not so sure I understand all the data anyway, but I'm going to show you what I see, and then you can decide whether I'm right or wrong in this review. So once again, here's the article. Now, let's see this. Yeah. So if you look at this, I have data here. I have a K-shaped economy here, which is a click, right? So that's, they're picking up on some other types of information, right? And if you read this, it would go through here, but it's giving us a few things. Top 1% of the households own 31.7% of all U.S. wealth in the third quarter of 2025. Now I'm looking at that. Well, what happened in the fourth quarter of 2025? What happened to the other 99%? Right? What's the relative wealth? Right? Is there really something behind this that's important? And then it says collectively, the wealthiest 1% held about $55 trillion in assets in the third quarter, roughly equal to the wealth held by the bottom 9%. Well, that's good. It's only half. So they got more money than they need, but the rest of us have $55 trillion as well. And I bet you that's not distributed equally. No one would think it is. Household wealth down here at the bottom is highly concentrated and becoming steadily more concentrated. Mark Zandi, chief economist of financial research firm Moody Analytics, told CBS News. One person giving this information. Dr. Slavanovic, in the days of Edward R. Murrow, in journalism at the time, did we have a balanced view? We said, here's what this person says, and here's what this person says in a country so that the consumer can make up their own mind?
Ideally, they would try and do that. Murrow in particular was noted for the research that he put into before he published anything. But I'm not going to say everybody did that.
Right. So from this perspective, that's what journalism is supposed to be, is just the facts and represent both sides so the consumer can read it. I deleted a quote that says, newspaper articles is printing what people don't want you to print. Everything else is advertising. And if you think about that quote, they're presenting what you don't want everyone else to know so that they can sell more advertising. Because if you wanted them to know, you would have to pay for the ad, right? And that's why you see full page editorials sometime in newspapers. All right. So what I thought was, well, what is a K-shaped economy? Anybody know what a K-shaped economy is? Well, the K-shape, so you look at that little K, that little leg going this way, right? That suggests that somebody is going up. And this suggests that somebody is going down. Now, depending on what you see in wages across the time, is most charts that I've seen show everybody is making more money, right? Some make it a lot more faster than others, but the curves tend to go up, right? And that can be inflation based. You can put an inflation factor in it. And then you see some people are not progressing to keep up with inflation. You can look at the numbers all different ways, right? But it is just data, right? So I said, well, I wonder who wrote that article, The K-Shaped Economy. Now, take note, Mary Cunningham wrote this on January 21st, 26. Mary Cunningham wrote the K-Shaped Economy article on November 5th. So she's citing herself. She's saying, I went back to my old article and decided that was so great, I wanted to share it as a baseline for my new article because I had a deadline due. Right? So, and in this article, there were some other things, and that I think this is the one that research from the African study came through, because I got there somehow. I don't know how I did that. So then I said, okay, well, let me go look at this data. Well, one of the things they talked about in this K-shaped economy is this report printed by Bank of America. Now, when we're talking about wealth, right? Wealth inequality, that was the headline that we're looking at. Well, this one is talking about total credit and debit card spending per household increased 2% year over year in September. So we're spending more money on credit cards and debit cards. Didn't say which is which. It just says that's the case. And then I look here and it says lower income households showed some spending recovery, but growth remains muted compared to middle and higher income. What it's saying is that they are spending more, it's just slower. Now, the question will be, are they spending more paying by credit card or debit card, right? Because if they're putting everything on credit, which we were doing during the recession, and what happened is we saw that a lot of people were using the stimulus checks to pay off their debt. But then when the economy opened back up, that debt increased at a higher rate. So could it be that people have already hit their credit card limits, and so now they can only spend what they make? Right? There's a story underneath this that we don't know the answer to, but we're taking this surface level data and saying this is fact to support my story. We then look a little further here. Housing wealth plays a supporting role and is spread across income distribution. Spending is limited. Now, have all their wealth in the stock market, right? And some of that is paper wealth, right? Like Elon Musk probably has some money in his bank account, but most of it is in stock. If stock market crashes, he loses money, right? The middle and lower income have their wealth in housing. So they're buying their houses. That's where their wealth is. So as you keep digging down, you start to see more and more of this real story start to shape up. And then it says here, the upturn in consumer spending continued into September. Well, there's a little chart here that they included. So I blew that chart up to get a little better view. And this chart is total upturn in consumer spending continued into September. Well, here's September. What's interesting is if I'm looking at this chart, I'm not really sure why they consider that continuing to go up. Once again, anthropologists, not economists, right? But as I look at this, what is happening here, right? It's just like a normal business cycle curve. So it just so happened that in this July timeframe, we saw an increase, and I can't tell the color. This is what services. We started having more services. We had more spending in retail, or less spending in retail, right? Less spending in retail. And we had this right here where we had less spending in gas. So gas prices looks like it's been going down. Services looks like we had a big month in whatever this month is, June. Not so much in July. Services went up in July. It's probably people going on vacations, right? Could make sense, right? I'm going my folk economics analysis here. But does this support anything? Not really, okay? So yes, well, let me go to the Fed, right? And this gets a little crazy because when you go to the Fed, you can come over here and you can click on this little button here and it refilters everything. And this was looking at from 1989 Q3 down to Q3 2025. And this is where they say that there's a big distribution. And if you look at this, it is 13.9, 14.0, 14.4, 17.3, 36.4, 29.4, 2.5. And if you look at that, those numbers are normally fluctuating. So is it higher? Yes. But is it significantly higher? Is it normal variation? Is it driven by some other business factor? We don't know. But we said the wealthy are getting wealthier and the poor are getting poorer. So what I did is I took all that data out of the Fed and created individual charts based on different categories, right? So this category here is by generation: baby boomer, Gen X, millennial, and silent generation. This one is by age group, right? And we see here that the age 70 is growing up. The age 55 to 69 is really going up. The age 40 to 54 is going down. And then whatever this red one is, age under 40 is going down. And this is wealth generated, right? Assets minus liabilities. I buy a house. All of a sudden, I don't have an asset. I have it's asset minus debt, right? It's value minus debt. So that's how you calculate the asset. This one over here is percent of income. Here's your top 1%, your next 10, and so forth. You see these are the lines here. Yeah, and there is a big distribution, and this purple here seems to be a lot larger than this blue line here. And then this brown line here, which is the 99 to 100 percentile net share, is right here. Well, there's a big purple one up here. It means something. I don't know what it means, but it means something, right? I can look at that and use my fast thinking heuristics, say something doesn't make sense. And then I can do the same thing across the board here. And then I look at the race and I see that there's a big race divide. Okay, that's nothing uncommon. We knew that exists. And then what I'm looking at is this chart and say, are we getting better in this space, right? Are we seeing improvement? Or from where they were to where they're going, are we seeing improvement, right? Because that's going to be the way that the economy grows, right? And I would want to probably dig into this a little bit more if I were trying to say, are we seeing improvement in the racial divides? I would need to say, I need more data. I can't make a determination. But what I did find interesting, and I thought this was important for us to know, because this is part of a financial literacy series, is this concept here of age groups. And looking at the age 55 to 69 seems to be acquiring wealth at a much higher rate than anyone else, right? That as a percent. And then what we see is that the 70 is increasing, right? But they're still below this. And then as you look at this, as we continue, and this is net share of the economy, right? This is not how much money they have. It's their percent of the total wealth of the economy, which in itself is a very difficult thing to even get our heads around. I'm not saying how much more money do they have in the bank account. I'm just saying of that group, how much do they share? Well, what we know is the baby boomers, right? They're shrinking because they're getting old and dying off. The wealth that they have, they're spending because they have to live. They're not accruing any more wealth. They're spending the wealth they have. I would expect to see that become a smaller percentage, right? X-Gen, if we're even on here, which we're not big enough to do anything, right? The millennials are now coming into an age which is the next big population. So they're going to start swaying the information. And maybe 5 years, 10 years from now, we will see a completely different chart because this new generation is coming in. Remember, the data that we're looking at is data that is not representative of this change in generation size, right? Number of working people, the jobs that they have, the types of jobs that they have. And then you have the red line, which is age under 40. You know, that is part of the millennials part of the Gen Z population who are just getting started. So what I wanted to look at here is taking all this information and looking at this, overlaying it with this retirement age curve, is what is the wealth that we could expect over our generations. And you see that over the age, what we do is we get to a peak level of wealth at retirement. Then what happens is that wealth starts to dwindle down. Because why? We're spending the money that we saved. Our 401ks, we're not working anymore, working less hours. We're now spending what we earn. So then I said, well, let me look at that and say if there's any real merit to that. So this is a lifetime wealth curve. Okay, lifetime wealth curve. And in this space, what you see is what I'm seeing in that data, and what I'm seeing in this is that we're just starting out. We're building wealth, but remember, we're also raising kids here. You know, my kid went for a PhD, so I had an extra 10 years of college to pay for. Then we're looking at, I'm now kids out of the house. I'm able to spend, although there's some argument I should just vacation more, and then let him pay for me in my old age. But then there's the retirement burn down. This is a normal curve, right? Normal curve. Now, the article also says that, hey, all of the wealthy people are buying all the stock. So once again, going down the rabbit hole of their citations, they cited this Gallup article that says, what percentage of American own stock? And they were saying that there's a divide in that. Well, when I actually look at this, college graduates, 84% of them own stock. That's not bad. Some college, 60%, high school, 42%. So that if you're in college, that's pretty good, right? That means you're going to own stock in the future if you don't already own stock. I know in my class, we have a stock market game that we purchase stock, just thereby practice purchasing stock. Upper income. They said that upper income owns all the stock. Well, okay. If you're making $100,000 or more, then 87%. But look at this, 84% college graduates. So there's some data in there that's correlated that we don't know about. Middle income, 50 to 99, 71% own stock. So the fact that they don't own stock, that's not really true anymore. Lower income, even lower income folks own stock. If I come down, non-Hispanic white adults, 70, non-Hispanic black adults, 53%, Hispanic adults, 38%, right? There's a little racial divide there, right? It's probably related up here, right? That's real, right? So there's nothing is all by itself. Everything is interconnected in this data, but even this data that says only the wealthy own stock and that the lower income people have all of their wealth included in their houses, this data doesn't suggest that. I did go back and look at prior reports of this and look over time and saw that there was a positive trend moving forward, but it's not a great positive trend, right? In that space. So, in closing, if people in the media cannot decide whether they are in the business of reporting new or manufacturing propaganda, it is all the more important that the public understand the differences and choose their news sources accordingly. I'm putting it back on you. You have to do the same type of work that I did and question every bit of data and ask yourself, is this the truth, or are they just trying to spin a story to sell more news articles? So with that, any questions? What do you think? Are you going to look at news articles a little differently now?
So far, nothing coming in from online.
I can't speak for all of Gen Z, my fellow Gen Zers, but I feel like as we grew up, we were kind of told by our parents that just assume most media is now partisan in some way. And there's a few news sources that you can look to as bipartisan, but data is kind of where you need to look at.
Yeah, that's true. There was an article when in the first Trump administration about the wall in Mexico, and the U.S. version of the Wall Street Journal said Mexico was paying for the wall. In the Mexican version of the Wall Street Journal, same company, U.S. is paying for the wall, right? Same wall, right? And there are some news feeds now that you can actually, have it change. I created an economic article reader using AI that actually looks at, you can upload an article and then it will tell you what the facts are. And then it'll tell you the theory behind the facts so that it helps you make that information. So.
Not a question, but a comment online. Very insightful presentation. Will definitely take more time to look at what sources are used in the news I read.